Hi guys, today we're going to study ecology, one of my favorite topics to study. This is something that I really focused on in college because it interested me so much. It's kind of the macro study of the biological world versus the micro, which would be like biotechnology and cell biology, things like that. So I was always more interested in animals and the way they interacted with each other, and that's really the study of ecology. So definitionally, it's the study of the relations of organisms to each other and their physical environment, or their abiotic components. And an ecosystem is an interacting biological community with their environment. So when we look at the word the environment, we're talking about both the abiotic and the biotic factors. Abiotic are the non-living factors like rocks, soil, air, water, and minerals. And the biotic factors are plants, animals, fungi, bacteria. So when we look at those things together, we're talking about how they interact and how the biotic components need the abiotic components. The habitat is where an organism lives, and the niche is the role or the job an organism plays in that environment. So I want you to go to the left of the page and look at the ecological pyramid. This represents a food chain in an ecosystem. And I want you to look at the different levels. Those are called trophic levels. We start at the bottom with the word autotroph. Autotrophs are producers, which are also plants. And so plants are at the base of the food chain because they are the support for all the other levels. The second level are the herbivores. We also call those the primary consumers. Herbivores are plant eaters, so logically they fit right above the plants. The next level are the omnivores, or the secondary consumers. Omnivores are animals that eat both plants and animals. And the top level are called the carnivores, or the tertiary consumers. So tertiary means third level. And then if you look at on the side, the word decomposers, that word represents those organisms that break down dead plants and animals. So both plants, herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores can be broken down by decomposers at any time when they die. So that's an ecological pyramid. But if you look to the left, there's something super important about this, and that's that the energy for all ecological pyramids or all food chains and all ecosystems starts with the sun. Below the pyramid, there's a statement. It says that only 10% of energy is transferred to the next trophic level because heat energy is released that cannot be used. It's not lost, it's just transformed. And that is because of the law of conservation of energy here on Earth. So that law states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it may change form. So what does that really mean when we're talking about ecosystems and ecological pyramids? It just simply means this, that there's a lot of energy that goes into growing things that cannot be utilized for energy. For example, let's look at autotrophs, which are the plants. If you take a look at a tree or any other plant, there's a lot of parts that take a lot of energy to grow, like the roots, the bark, the trunk, the branches. But those are not easily digested by herbivores. And so even though herbivores will eat plants, they're not eating those parts of the plants. There's only a few species, for example, that can eat bark and get nutrition from it. Termites would be one. So what happens to the energy that it took to make all those things? Just think of a really big old tree. It took a lot of energy to grow the trunk and the roots. That energy, once that plant or that tree dies and starts to break down, that energy is just lost as heat, okay? It's not something that is fed on directly by a herbivore. Decomposers eventually will break it down, but there's a lot of that energy that's just lost as heat. So only 10% is transferred to the herbivores. And then of the herbivore level, that trophic level, only 10% of it is transferred to the omnivore level. And of the omnivores, only 10% of their total energy is transferred to the tertiary or carnivores. So it's just important to understand that ecosystems are fragile. And if you think about it kind of logistically, you would never want an ecosystem in the shape of a rectangle or an inverted pyramid, because that would mean that the herbivores would eat the autotrophs really quickly, right? If you flip this pyramid upside down and it was shaped the opposite direction, it would collapse. And so you don't want to have ecosystem collapse. The other important thing to note about the ecological pyramid is that the animals that are at the top, let's look at carnivores, their job or their niche is to control the omnivores and the herbivores because they feed on other animals. And the omnivore's job is to control the herbivores and the plants. And the herbivore's job is to control the plants as well. And so each of those levels the organisms in those levels have specific niches. Something that's unique about ecosystems is that they all have what we call keystone species that do things that other animals don't do. They aren't necessarily at the top. They may not be a carnivore. They could be a herbivore or an omnivore. A great example is a beaver. A beaver is an animal that does things that other animals can't do, and we call that a keystone species. For example, beavers will go to rivers, and if there is an ample food supply for them, like willows and cottonwoods, they will start to cut down those willows and cottonwoods. The first thing they do is they build a dam, and then they do that to slow the water down so that then they can build their lodge, and then they can have their babies and live in that lodge. And what they'll do with the branches from the cottonwoods and the willows is they'll build the floor of their lodge higher and higher until it's out of the water. And then they'll start sticking all kinds of branches and things around it. And they'll feed on that through the winter. When we go to the South Platte River, that's one of the things that I show people is an active beaver lodge and dam that the beavers on the South Platte are continually rebuilding and fixing. We call them nature's little engineers. But the thing that they do, the reason that they're called keystone is that when they slow the water down by building the dam, they're creating a different type of aquatic ecosystem. So the river is one type of aquatic ecosystem, but when the beavers slow the water down, it's more like a pond ecosystem that brings lots of different species of animals and supports animals that need slower water. And so a healthy river ecosystem is one that has beavers potentially in lots of different areas along its route. So there's keystone species. There's also keystone predators. And so those would be animals that are carnivores that have a unique role. Maybe they're the only species that can feed on a specific type of omnivore or herbivore. So another concept that I didn't write down on here, but I want you to know is cascading. And so when there's a cascade effect in an ecological pyramid or in a food chain, that means that something happens at a level that affects all the other levels. So if we lose carnivores, for example, mountain lions, grizzly bears, even black bears, they're considered omnivores just like grizzlies, but they are a top level consumer. They feed on lots of animals. If we lose species like them, then the levels below them can grow out of control. What happens to herbivores like mule deer or elk? If their herds are not kept in check, they can get lots of disease because there's so many of them competing for the same resources. I hope that makes sense to you guys. Let's take a look at the levels of organization over to the right in the middle of the paper. This is referring to the levels of organization in ecosystems. But let's step back a moment and look at human beings. Our human bodies are made up of atoms that make up organelles that make up our cells. And our cells make up tissues. Our tissues make up organs. Our organs make up organ systems. And organ systems together make up a human being or a species. It can make up all different kinds of animals. Well, we can take it a step further, those levels of organization, into the ecological world and say that species make up populations, populations make up communities, communities make up ecosystems, ecosystems make up biomes, and biomes together of the world make up our biosphere. So Let me step back to biomes. Biomes are those areas of the world that are really specific and unique. We'll start at the top of the earth. You have the polar biome. Below that, you have the tundra. Below that, you have the boreal forest, temperate forests, temperate grasslands. I'm still moving south in lower elevation and latitude. You also have the deserts at about 30 degrees north and south latitude. And then you're getting into the tropics. So you've got tropical savannas, tropical rainforests, subtropical rainforests. And so those are the biomes. Let's step back now and go back to populations. So when we look at species of organisms, let's say one species, and we'll consider a prairie ecosystem. All the prairie dogs in that prairie ecosystem would be considered a population. All the burrowing owls in that prairie ecosystem would be a population. All the rattlesnakes would be a population. The bull snakes would be a population. The grasshoppers would be a population. So all the organisms, the individual types of organisms make up populations, and their reaction together make up a community. And those communities interacting together make up the prairie ecosystem. Okay, so that's how those different levels of organization work. Take a look at how energy flows in ecosystems. So I drew this to represent how energy starts with the energy of the sun. So energy in ecosystem starts with the energy of the sun, and it's given to the producers who use the sun's energy through the process of photosynthesis to make oxygen and glucose. And that oxygen and glucose is utilized by the consumers that we just talked about in the ecological pyramid. And they use it through this process called cellular respiration. They take in oxygen and glucose, and they give off carbon dioxide and water. And that, in turn, is taken in by producers. So if you look, I've written out that in equation format for photosynthesis and cellular respiration. I forgot to write cellular respiration there, but the second equation is cellular respiration. So photosynthesis is where plants take in carbon dioxide and water. You can see that on the left side of the arrow in the presence of sunlight and chlorophyll. That's a little leaf there. And produce glucose, oxygen, and energy. So these are the chemical formulas, okay? So that's photosynthesis. The next formula is cellular respiration. This is what we do. So plants do photosynthesis, and humans and all other animals do cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is where we take in glucose. So if you ate a steak last night, your body is breaking down the proteins in that steak to this molecule called glucose. And it uses glucose and oxygen in the presence of special enzymes in our body to produce water, carbon dioxide, and energy. So you have the ability to sit there and listen to me right now because of the energy that you've eaten. And through this process of cellular respiration, breaking down that food into energy. So let's take a look over to the left. We've talked about food chains. Food web is a system of interacting food chains in a biome. It's just multiple food chains together. Populations, like we talked about before, have limits. So this is example, prairie dogs. Their population is limited based on the resources that are available. And so once a population stops growing, it is said to have reached its carrying capacity. So there's density-dependent factors that affect populations and density-independent factors. To the right, if you look at symbiotic relationships, there's several different ways that organisms interact with each other, and that's a symbiotic relationship. The first kind is mutualism, where both species benefit. A second is commensalism, where one species benefits and the other is not benefited nor harmed. It gets nothing. Parasitism is where one species benefits while the other is harmed. And then a predator-prey relationship is where certain species control populations through feeding. So a mountain lion feeds on a deer. That's a predator-prey relationship. Well, that does it for our study in ecology. I hope you learned something. We're going to use this as we progress to our next lesson. Take care, guys. Have a great day. Bye.